Before Wilbur Whateley ever raised a hand against Dunwich, Lovecraft had already written him into existence as himself.
That's not metaphor. Years earlier, Lovecraft wrote a different monster, one who looks in a mirror and weeps at what he's become.
By 1929, that monster doesn't weep anymore. He fights back.
And Lovecraft buried the proof of it in plain sight. A quote that opens the story, lifted from a 19th century essayist who meant it as comfort.
Lovecraft twisted it into something closer to a confession.
So the real question in Dunwich isn't what's hiding in the hills.
It's who Lovecraft thought the actual monster was, and whether he wants you to agree with him.
Okay, let's unpack this and step into the fictional world of Dunwich.
It's a setting that really requires you to, brace yourself.
Yeah.
Lovecraft doesn't just place you in a town. He buries you in an atmosphere of utter decay.
He really does. So picture this. Dunwich is this isolated backwater in north-central Massachusetts. The roads are dusty and rutted, the gorges are impossibly deep, and the few scattered houses look like they are literally rotting right into the earth.
It's completely cut off.
Completely. It's a place where the locals are described as completely isolated from the world, sunk into this dark lineage of isolation and violence. But the creepiest part, the hills themselves, they constantly rumble with these unexplained noises beneath the earth.
And the local lore about the birds.
Yes, the birds. The area is swarming with whippoorwills. And the legend says these birds gather outside the homes of the dying, and they time their eerie cries exactly to the person's failing breath.
They're just waiting in the dark to catch the departing soul. It's a brilliant establishment of atmosphere. Lovecraft creates an environment where nature itself feels actively hostile and expectant.
It's incredibly bleak.
And it is within this cursed environment that we are introduced to the Whateley family. They are a bloodline that has essentially splintered into ruin.
Right.
At the center of this is old Whateley, who is a man widely reputed to be a wizard, and his daughter, Lavinia. She's described as an unattractive, deformed albino woman who just wanders the hills during thunderstorms.
And then, in 1913, Lavinia gives birth to a son named Wilbur. Now, there is no known human father.
That's a crucial detail.
Very. And from day one, Wilbur is fundamentally wrong. He's described as a dark, goatish-looking child, and his growth rate is just shocking. He walks completely unassisted at 7 months old. He talks fluently by 11 months. By the time he is 3 years old, he literally looks like a 10-year-old boy.
Which, as we'll unpack later when we look at Lovecraft's own life, the absence of a father and this profound physical alienation, they are incredibly loaded details. But within the fiction itself, as Wilbur grows, the unnaturalness of his existence becomes impossible to hide.
Especially from the animals.
Exactly. Dogs possess this violent, instinctual hatred of him.
I always found that detail so striking. You have to imagine the bizarre horror of this. A 3-year-old toddler, but he's the size of a teenager, and he's forced to carry a loaded pistol just to walk safely through the countryside.
Just to go outside.
Yeah, because every dog in the county wants to tear his throat out.
It creates this intense feeling of a character at war with the natural world. Meanwhile, his grandfather, old Whateley, is actively nurturing whatever darkness is inside the boy. He builds Wilbur this massive locked library filled with rotting occult books, and he's teaching him ancient forbidden rituals.
And the grandfather is constantly doing heavy carpentry, right? He's knocking out walls in the farmhouse, boarding up the entire upper floor. No one in town knows what's up there, but the locals can hear a strange, massive, shifting sound.
Looking at all this, what's fascinating here is Lovecraft's deliberate pacing and his absolute mastery of sensory horror.
How so?
He doesn't just show you a monster, he makes you smell it. He introduces this terrible, unearthly stench emanating from the locked and boarded up farmhouse. He lets the reader hear the constant, frantic carpentry as the house is modified from the inside out to accommodate something.
Something big.
Right. The horror is implied through these suffocating environmental details long before it is ever actually seen.
Which brings us to the Miskatonic incident. By the time Wilbur is supposedly a young adult, he is fully 8 feet tall. He's this stooped, giant, goatish man.
But he needs a book.
Desperately. He travels to Miskatonic University in Arkham because he needs a specific spell from the most dangerous book in the world, the Necronomicon. But the head librarian, Dr. Henry Armitage, takes one look at Wilbur, senses the absolute cosmic evil dripping off him, and just outright denies him access.
So Wilbur is desperate. He tries to break into the library at night.
But he doesn't make it.
No, he is attacked and killed by the university's savage guard dog, which leads to one of the most grotesque autopsies in literary history. When Dr. Armitage and his colleagues find Wilbur's body in the library, the dog has torn away his clothing, revealing the terrifying truth about his anatomy.
Walk us through what they actually find on that library floor, because it is far, far from human.
Not even close to human. From the waist up, his chest is covered in the leathery, reticulated hide of a crocodile. The text uses the word saurian to describe his legs, essentially meaning they look like they belong to a prehistoric lizard or dinosaur.
Like scales.
Yeah, and his back is piebald, meaning it is patchy and two-toned, almost like snake scales. But below the waist, the biology completely breaks down.
This is the part that always gets me.
Sprouting from his abdomen are a score of long, greenish-gray tentacles, each ending in a red, sucking mouth. He has rudimentary eyes set into pinkish orbits on his hips, and when he bleeds, it isn't blood. It's an ichor-fetid, greenish-yellow alien fluid.
And as he dies on the library floor, his body literally begins to dissolve into a sticky, whitish mass. It's incredibly visceral. But his death is really just the prologue here.
Right, because Wilbur was keeping things contained.
Exactly. Wilbur was the one casting the spells to keep the farmhouse locked down. With Wilbur dead, the other thing in the Whateley farmhouse, the thing Wilbur had been feeding and making space for in that boarded-up second story, breaks loose.
It bursts out of the farmhouse like a creature hatching from an eggshell. And the terrifying part is that it's completely invisible. The only way the people of Dunwich know it's there is the sheer scale of the destruction.
It's almost like a localized invisible tornado. It leaves these massive deep tracks in the mud the size of giant wooden barrels. It literally flattens entire swaths of ancient forest as it moves.
This begins the true reign of terror in Dunwich. The unseen mountainous beast retreats into the deep, shadowy ravine of Cold Spring Glen during the day, but at night it ravages the farms.
And it's not looking for meat.
No, it targets the local cattle to slurp the blood dry. The panic in Dunwich becomes absolute when the invisible horror eventually attacks a human household, completely obliterating the entire Elmer Fry family and crushing their home into splinters.
The locals are terrified and completely helpless. Luckily, Dr. Armitage realizes what Wilbur left behind. He arrives in Dunwich with 2 academic colleagues, and they are armed with esoteric spells translated from Wilbur's encrypted diary and a mechanical sprayer filled with a magical chemical powder.
They track the invisible beast as it crawls up the sheer vertical side of Sentinel Hill,
which culminates in the final confrontation. Armitage sprays the chemical powder into the air, and for a split second, the invisible horror is made fully visible to the terrified locals watching through a telescope at the bottom of the hill.
The rustic testimony from the source text is just incredibly vivid here.
Yeah, the locals describe it as bigger than a barn. It's shaped like a massive hen's egg, but it's made entirely of wriggling, squirming, jelly-like ropes.
It has dozens of legs like hogsheads, which were those massive wooden barrels they used back in the day, and these legs shut up when they step.
And it has giant mouths along its sides like stovepipes, constantly opening and shutting.
But the ultimate horror isn't the tentacles or the sheer scale of the creature. The true nightmare is right at the top of this alien mass.
Perched on top of this mountain of wriggling flesh is a half-formed, gigantic human face, and it looks exactly like old Whateley. It's a warped, monstrous reflection of the family bloodline.
As Armitage finishes his spell and a cataclysmic lightning bolt shoots down from the sky, the beast screams out in English.
It yells out, "Father! Father, Yog Sothoth," before being completely blasted out of existence.
It really is a thrilling pulp action climax, a battle between brave academics and a cosmic monstrosity.
But here's where it gets really interesting. If we close the book on the fiction and open the Taskerland essay, we find a completely different story.
A very different story.
The essay forces us to look beyond the monster and focus on the man who created it.
From a critical standpoint, the Dunwich Horror is a strange piece of work. As the essay notes, critics like S.T. Joshi have called the story an aesthetic mistake and a mechanical romp.
Though Lovecraft was actually paid $240 for it, which was his biggest check yet at the time.
It was very successful commercially. It was even packaged by the U.S. military in 1945 in a special edition to entertain troops abroad. It reads like a commercial action-adventure story, but as an action story, it's actually quite clunky.
How so?
Well, the climax is bogged down by strategic ambiguity, and it's filtered entirely through heavily stylized rustic dialects.
Right, you're not even watching the final fight firsthand. You're hearing about it from farmers looking through a telescope, shouting about what they see.
Exactly. But the Taskerland essay argues that if you look past this somewhat botched action climax, the story is incredibly profound. It is literally an eruption of Lovecraft's own personal trauma.
The parallels between the monstrous Wilbur Whateley and H.P. Lovecraft himself are just staggering.
Let's break those parallels down, starting with the grandfather and the library. Just like Wilbur, Lovecraft grew up fatherless. He was raised by his grandfather, Whipple Phillips, who provided him with a massive library.
And that access turned Lovecraft into an autodidact, someone who is completely self-taught outside of the traditional schooling system.
Old Whateley acts as the exact same figure for Wilbur, curating his dark education.
So Wilbur's entire origin is practically Lovecraft's exact setup. Then there's the academic rejection. Lovecraft was brilliant, but completely lacked formal credentials. He desperately sought validation from the academic world, but was always kept on the outside looking in.
This is mirrored perfectly in the story when Wilbur travels to Miskatonic University and is outright rejected and denied access by Dr. Armitage and the academic elite.
The most heartbreaking parallel, however, is the physical insecurity. The essay shares a devastating historical detail.
Yes.
Lovecraft's own mother was recorded as describing her son as so hideous that he hid from people on the street, refusing to let them gaze upon him.
Your own mother calling you hideous, that is incredibly grim.
It is. And when you realize that, Wilbur's goatish ugliness, his isolation, and the violent societal rejection he faces take on a completely new meaning. It is a direct, agonizing reflection of Lovecraft's own self-image.
Wilbur isn't just a scary monster. He is how Lovecraft feared the world saw him.
The essay also discusses Lovecraft's time in New York and how that environment influenced the town of Dunwich itself. He went to the city, failed to secure work, was starving, and was watching immigrants succeed where he felt he was failing.
If we connect this to the bigger picture, the Taskerland essay points out that Lovecraft's real-world failures in New York fueled an intense racism and class panic within him.
We see this bleeding directly into the Dunwich Horror through his descriptions of the degenerate, inbred local populace of Dunwich.
It's important for us as hosts to step back and look at this objectively. We're looking at his worldview not to endorse it or debate the politics of it, but as a forensic tool to understand why he built his fictional worlds the way he did.
Right. It is a factual observation of how his bitter worldview and intense personal resentments were projected onto the fictional setting.
It's entirely about understanding the psychology that built the world of Dunwich. And nothing highlights that psychology better than the monster's dying scream on top of Sentinel Hill. Father Yog-Sothoth.
That scream is the key to the entire psychological artifact. Lovecraft's own father suffered a psychotic breakdown in a hotel when Lovecraft was just 3 years old.
The man was taken away to an asylum where he eventually died.
Lovecraft essentially never knew his father. He was just a ghost, an absence hidden behind institutional walls.
So when the massive invisible beast is dying and it cries out for its cosmic father, Yog-Sothoth, we aren't just hearing a monster roaring in pain.
According to the essay, it is Lovecraft's corrupted fantasy. It is the yearning for a father he never had.
But instead of imagining a protective human parent, Lovecraft reimagines his absent father as a powerful, world-ending cosmic abomination.
Wilbur and the Beast are cursed by their bloodline. But in that curse, they find a terrible, destructive strength that Lovecraft himself lacked in the real world.
So what does this all mean? When we put all these pieces together, the fatherless upbringing, the academic rejection, the mother calling him hideous, the class panic, what does it tell us about the author's evolution over his career?
Well, the Taskerland essay maps out a really dark progression in Lovecraft's work. If you look at one of his earlier stories, like The Outsider, he writes about a lonely monster who just wants to belong to human society.
The character emerges from the dark, sees himself in a mirror, realizes he is a monster, and the tone is one of profound pity and tragedy.
Wait, so how does a writer go from feeling pity for a monster who just wants a hug to turning it into an invisible, world-destroying weapon?
Time and bitterness. By the time he writes the Dunwich Horror, years of poverty, isolation, and perceived failure have completely darkened his self-portrait.
Wilbur Whateley isn't a tragic victim looking for acceptance.
No, he is twisted, deceptive, and fully weaponized against the world that rejected him. Lovecraft took his own real-world weaknesses and transformed them into Wilbur's terrifying strengths.
This brings us to the quote that literally opens the Dunwich Horror. Lovecraft chose a quote from the 19th century essayist Charles Lamb. It reads, "The archetypes are in us and eternal." I think we need to slow down here because the context of that quote changes everything. What did Lamb actually mean when he wrote that?
Charles Lamb wrote that to reassure people. He was discussing the universal fears that children have, like being afraid of the dark. By saying the archetypes are in us, he was essentially arguing, don't worry about monsters under the bed, they're just archetypes of fear in your own human imagination. The threat isn't real.
But the essay points out the tragic irony here. Lovecraft didn't use that quote as a reassurance.
He used it as a terrifying confession.
The rotting landscapes, the degenerate bloodlines, the invisible world-destroying monsters. Lovecraft is admitting they aren't out there in the cosmos.
They are eternal archetypes living inside the author himself. The horror of Dunwich is the claw of self-recognition tightening at Lovecraft's own throat.
It fundamentally changes how you read the story.
Yeah.
If you pick up the Dunwich Horror now, it's not just a gripping pulp tale of an invisible monster smashing barns and sucking the blood from cattle.
It is a profound forensic look at an isolated man weaponizing his own grief, his familial madness, and his societal rejection into a tapestry of cosmic dread.
This raises an important question. If we understand the true psychological origins of this story, how does that shift our sympathies as readers?
I want to leave you, the listener, with a final thought to mull over something not explicitly stated in our sources, but which builds right out of this psychological autopsy. What if we flip the perspective of the story entirely?
Consider the narrative from the other side. What if the true tragedy of Dunwich isn't that an alien god tried to invade Massachusetts?
What if the tragedy is that a marginalized, fatherless family, living in poverty and despised by everyone around them, desperately tried to build a bridge to the only universe that would accept them?
And their reward for trying to find their place in the cosmos was to be hunted down and completely exterminated by the normal, well-adjusted, well-funded, academic elite of Miskatonic University.
When you view it through the lens of Lovecraft's own trauma and rejection, who, in the end, are the real monsters?
A fascinating angle to consider as we close this case file. Thank you for joining us on this deep dive into the archives. Keep looking past the surface of the text and keep questioning the stories you read. We'll see you next time.